Hi, my name is Mitch Bertrang. I'm one of the many volunteers with the Minnesota wing of the Commemorative Air Force, here today at EAA 2022 Air Venture, and behind me is the beautiful B-25J bomber, Miss Mitchell. So we're going to be doing a little bit of walk around on this aircraft and talk a little bit about its history and some of the unique features of this B-25 and some of the restoration projects that we've accomplished and we still have in process. So the very first thing would be the nose art on this aircraft. This nose art was painted by the actual artist that painted it back in 1944, and it was Ray Kowalik. And Ray was just a young tech sergeant. He worked on instrumentation, things like that, and he painted quite a number of the B-25s within the 310th Bomb Group. The aircraft arrived in the spring of 1944, and they chose this nose art. It was a beautiful, brand new, non-painted aircraft, and it was, one of the stories is they wanted to name it something to kind of give it honor of how pretty it was, you know, like Miss America, Miss Minnesota, Miss Wisconsin, Miss Mitchell, of course named after the World War II B-25, Miss Mitchell named after Billy Mitchell. And it was a centerfold or a gatefold from Esquire magazine, and it was Esquire magazine in 1943 December, and it will always be Christmas. The original gatefold had a scarf that came off of it, and my understanding was the reason they didn't put the scarf on, which is on some other aircraft, is because they wanted to be able to put the bombing missions. And when we go to the other side, you'll see that there's over 130 bombing missions. The particular airframe, the original Miss Mitchell, so full clarity, this is not the original Miss Mitchell. Miss Mitchell did survive the war without any fatalities on that aircraft. It came back, and its last port of call when it was taken out of storage was at Aberdeen Proving Ground. And those that know Aberdeen Proving Ground, they blow things up. So it was a recipient of an air-to-ground missile, and that was its final mission. And you know what? A lot of people talk about, you know, it's a shame how all these aircraft got chopped up and they got blown up and stuff, but you know, at least she didn't go to Kingman and simply get chopped up and melted down. So if it was going to happen, I kind of think it's a good story. This particular airframe, which came off the assembly line on November 10th, 1944, came off a line and it was a trainer. And the reason that we have so many of these B-25s, because there's a number of airframes that still fly in different states of restoration, is because after the war, B-25s were flown for quite a while. This particular airframe, it flew until 1957, and the last aircraft, the B-25, that flew with the United States Air Force was until the spring of 1960. So you can see how well they were used and how adaptable they were. Let's face it, they had a lot of R-2600 engines. It's a medium bomber. It was a great base aircraft. It was good for transporting people from base to base. And this particular airframe was a radar trainer. So it was kind of neat, the fact that it lasted until 1957. It was released, once it went into surplus, then it was released out of surplus, and it went through a number of hands, pretty much like all warbirds eventually do. So let's walk around the aircraft. We've already talked about the beautiful Vargas on here, and that I know of, it may very well be the only warbird that's still potentially flying out there with the original artist. Ray Kowalik actually did paint this, and he also painted in the Mediterranean, in Corsica, Italy and stuff. So that's pretty incredible. North American Aviation, you know, 1939, they designed this aircraft, and you know, they started production not that much later. 1940 it took first flight. 41 they're building these, and they made A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and J's. Now the meat in the middle were some photographic versions that kind of had these bug eyes on them, so they didn't make very many of the F's and the E's, that sort of thing. The J was the last model, and the J, those were made over in Kansas City, Kansas at the Fairfax plant. And at the same time, they were also making H's. If you've ever seen the ones that had the cannon, the 75mm cannon, they made 1,000 of those in Inglewood, California at the same time. So hopefully you can still hear me here as we walk along our aircraft. You'll notice that it's missing some things that people think it might be missing, when in fact it's not. When Miss Mitchell got to the Med, they removed a lot of the things that they didn't need. This wasn't an aircraft that was going to be bombing at 20,000 feet. It was going to be lower on the deck. It was going to be attacking marshalling yards, bridges, that sort of thing. So they took the alcohol system out of it. They took the oxygen system. They took the de-icing boots out. They took the heaters out. It didn't need any of those things. And all they were going to do was add more weight and, add just more hazard, really. So those were taken out. So as we've done the restoration, we've done everything we can to try to get it back to the original Miss Mitchell. Now, backing up a little bit, the reason why we chose this artwork on here is because Ray Osley was a member of the Commemorative Air Force Minnesota wing. He was also the crew chief on all three of the aircraft of the Miss Mitchell crews. And when they got into deciding what to name this aircraft, it really made sense. Why not name it after Ray's aircraft? There were no fatalities. It was quite a blessed aircraft to go over 130 missions without a fatality. So as we walk along the aircraft, I like to show people what North American did. And you'll notice that we end up having flush rivets all through here. But as we get back and we start having that zone where the air starts getting that separation, about that 1 inch of separation, you'll notice that we go to button heads. So why do we want to do that? Button heads are a lot easier to put in. I don't have to take and have the complexity of countersinking them. And you'll notice all the way back we have button heads, but in the front, everything is flush rivets in this aircraft. Whereas like the B-25, that ends up having flush rivets. Glenn L. Martin, that's the way they designed that aircraft. It's a pretty slippery airframe and stuff. That's really not what this aircraft was designed for. And of course, it was the famous Doolittle raid. When we talk about the 16 B-25 bombers flying off the USS Hornet, that B-25 that flew off the USS Hornet was a little bit different than what this B-25. Again, this is the later model, the J model. And the empennage was different. We now have a gun position back there. They didn't have that. They had a ventral turret back here that dropped down. Of course, that was removed. The fuel configuration was slightly different. Of course, they added all that fuel. 1,441 gallons was put on that, and they flew it off 2,000 pounds over design weight. That in and of itself, we don't have enough time. That's an incredible story. So as we're doing this walk around, why don't we go up inside a little bit and then we'll walk back outside and we'll kind of mix this video up. So we're in the aft section right now. Now, let me tell you a little bit of a story here. So this aircraft was acquired in the 1980s. And when we got it, it was this green kind of a hulk of an aircraft, and it needed to have a full restoration. So they spent 12 years, and it took its first flight after restoration in 1992 at the 50th anniversary of the Doolittle raid. So it was time for that. So pretty incredible to get the amount of work they had to accomplish in those 12 years. Sounds like a long time, but those of us in the warbird community, we know that that's actually not that long. When that airframe was finished, it was absolutely empty. It was an empty shell. We did not have a turret. We didn't have the aft gun position. It was just this beautiful, shiny aircraft. So now, let's go ahead and fast forward. It's 2022. In all that time, we continued to do restoration. There's times where we're going a little bit faster and slower. And as we all know, it's all about donations because we are a nonprofit and everybody's a volunteer here. So I spend actually a fair amount of time back here. The back of the aircraft I think is kind of fascinating. So let's kind of look around here. I'll have you back up here a little bit. So in the last number of years, we've installed all the racking for the ammunition boxes. We got this finished up. This is the SCR 578, so nicknamed the Gibson Girl. And with the shelf, there were a couple of different configuration. This would be more appropriate for Miss Mitchell. It was a little bit later war where they didn't have the tube anymore and they had everything enclosed. And you're saying, okay, what's in there, Mitch? We have box kite, balloons, hydrogen generator, and then of course the famous Gibson girl, which would go between your legs and has that shape for your thighs right here, and it has a crank on it for a generator. And if you're going to ditch this aircraft, I need a way to hopefully contact somebody to get rescued. And all that's inside here, and that would be, if it was a ditching, it would be thrown out. And we recently acquired the parachute for it. And that's all hooked on, you throw it out, and everything gets deployed. If you're going to be doing a landing, not in water, it would stay put. Now this is a low frequency, so it needs to have a long antenna, and you need to have a ground in there. So this is a pretty important survival unit, and it needs to be able to transmit quite a distance. So when they made these, they still had the old shelf in here, and this is configured, like I said, for a little bit earlier. Now we did the armor plating here, and it was kind of an interesting story. A couple years ago, this is about a year-long project, this plating had to go in, and this plating becomes really important because everything feeds this direction and feeds this direction. As we're walking forward, you might notice we have a shelf sitting here and we have a shelf sitting here. The armor plating is kind of part of this because very, very soon, hopefully 2022, these rails are going to go in, and they're being made by one of our members, and he does absolutely meticulous work. That's going to allow us to put in the flex chutes here in order to bring those 50 cals to our waist guns. And the only reason they're not in there is we made the decision a long time ago that if we can't make it perfect, we're not going to install it. And these will be perfect once we get them in. I mean, everything in here down to the mic switches that have gone in are exactly from the North American plans. Obviously, we have a few modern things that we have to have in the aircraft, fire extinguishers and things like that, and placards. But we're trying to get it back. And you know, everything does come out. We can take these, we can move them. So now imagine once we get these chutes in here, it's going to get a little bit tighter back here. And that's what I always kind of tell people. This was not a pleasant place when you had all of this, and then if you look back, and we'll crawl back there in a bit, there was also chutes that went back to the aft turret. It's actually a turret. It doesn't have to spin to be a turret. It's a Bell rear gun position. Up here, we have a few things in the back here. We have the heater controls, the 24 volt for the heated suits. They probably weren't wearing heated suits because remember, they took the heaters out, they took the oxygen, they took all that stuff out, and we're in Italy. We have the lanyards for the throat mics. We've tried to put those in, and we also even have the headset adapters in here. We use modern headsets. This is an incredibly noisy aircraft, and we did bypasses so that we can still use those adapters. What happened is they have the communication devices throughout the aircraft. Later it appears they ended up changing the headsets in a way of adapting these aircraft without having to redesign all the audio system in these different, the B-17s, 24s. They ended up using an adapter in order to adjust the impedance for the headsets. So those are the kind of small little details we're trying to get. If you're able to look back, we've got a headset back there, but all the wiring for the radios, we have the radios all set up here, down to the small little rubber boots, the filters here. Hopefully your light will pick some of this up. We have an intervalometer we have a K24 camera. Great story, that came out of Europe. We found that a number of years ago, still sealed in its original box after upwards of 70 years, still had the desiccant bags in it, and it's that large format camera. The window had been removed from this particular airframe, and we went through researching getting that window back, and then going in, and during our winter maintenance, we're offline for 4 months. That's a nice thing about being in Minnesota. We can take these airplanes offline, and every year we know we have 4.5 months to work in the aircraft and really do that meticulous detail. That's an exciting little piece. The seat back just recently went in. This is one of the items that I'm really proud of. This is our BC966A IFF, and the IFF, that's a pretty rare item to have, and that uses pulse modulation on the same frequency, for example, where radar would be coming up, looking at the aircraft, trying to decide, is this a friend or is it a foe? So IFF, identification, friend or foe. And inside it has these beautiful stainless steel, I believe, fingers, and that sends the pulse. Now the PIC, or the pilot in command, he has the ability to change that pulse setting, in order to be identified as friend or foe. So of course we have identification friend or foes that was used during D-Day. You know, they figured out that all these IFF systems were going to get overwhelmed during D-Day, and that's why those invasion stripes went on. Or in the case of Operation Husky, we ended up inadvertently shooting down quite a number of our aircraft because people, they had been getting bombed by the Germans, and these young men ended up shooting down some of our own aircraft. So identification has always been an issue, and of course it's in modern aircraft now. And this is just another example. The antenna system goes down to the AN95 antenna, and the interesting on this one, it also has a detonation plug. So there would be a detonation charge that would go in here. You have lights, so when everything is powered up, you have to know there's a sequence to putting everything together here, plugging together, so you don't accidentally detonate it by having an energized circuit. And you were able, it would either self-destruct itself by having this self-destruction switch which was set for the G-force, or you have you can manually do it. The PIC has a red box, you press both buttons, that sends a current and it blows up the charge. So this pesky little plug, took me about 2 years to find one of those little plugs because they don't exist very easily to find. Up here, this just went in only a couple of weeks ago. This is going to be part of our the SCR 522 system, which is the radios to be able to talk from ship to ship. This just went in. So people always ask the question, well, is there a way to get over the bomb bay? The thing was on the bomb bay is the fact that radios did go up here, dynamotors, that sort of thing. So to answer the question, yes, you could do it, but let's face it, this crew member did not go crawling back and forth to get a Diet Coke and peanuts. I mean, this was their position. This was the radio gunner. He was responsible for these 250 cals and also responsible for operating the radios and stuff. And by the way, talking about the radios, we also do have the low frequency trailing antenna, and that spools out of the lower portion of the aircraft. You can go up, 100 plus feet, and you set everything here in order to deploy it and to reel it back. And everything's back here. But the only thing that we're missing that'll happen this winter, there's going to be a footrest that's going to go in here, and there's a couple other little things. But the last 10 plus years of work have really paid off to try to get this back to what it needs to be. And again, had this been an aircraft that was not in that theater of operation, you would end up having some heater ducts. The last remaining thing that we're going to work on, and we have it, it's just going to take a number of years of work. There was a life raft compartment. We have that because this was removed because it was a trainer. We're going to be putting that back into this aircraft. I'm hoping maybe in the next 3 to 4 years that'll happen. There's some structural things and some things that have to happen, and at the end of the day, it's all about money. Getting some of these things fabricated that we can't do in-house. If we want to crawl back a little bit, I'll go back here. Restoration-wise, you'll notice that there's some ammunition boxes right here. And in the original aircraft, there would be feed chutes, and they were phenolic, and they would start horizontal, and then they would work their way vertical and then back to horizontal. So in the rear gun position, which is the most difficult and important thing to have, that's all done. It's functional, it elevates, it goes left and right, but we do have some major hurdles in getting these built per the specs, and then also making the armor plating. The armor plating won't be too bad. The plans are out there for it to be a matter of cutting that, and it's homogeneous steel plates. So that's also a project that's still probably over the next 5 years we'll be working on those. So we're going to slowly keep chipping away at that glacier. But I'm pretty excited to be able to show the aft section of the aircraft. And you'll notice we don't have airline seats. The seats that are in the aircraft are either original or accurate reproductions. During the COVID, I spent about 100 days making new seats, and I could bore you to tears with that. But the seats, by the way, are made out of spruce, they're made out of birch, and the seat itself is 3-ply, 1/16 inch mahogany plywood. That's all the thicker it was. And they did things like hollowing out the back of the nosing in order to reduce the weight, and then reinforcing it with some dowels. It's absolutely fascinating, just as something as simple as the seats, what North American aviation did, because it was all about cutting costs and lowering weight, correct? So we want to get these airplanes off the line as fast as possible. We have we had tons of furniture builders and we had plenty of resources, but you always want to save this resource, which is aluminum. We're also going to be replacing some of that plexiglass probably this winter. There's some fairly aggressive crazing because that is original plexi. So let's walk a little bit around the nacelle here and just talk briefly about these engines. So these are Wright Cyclone 2600 cubic inch, 14 cylinder, 1700 horsepower. The interesting thing about this particular engine, I always look over to where this TBM is sitting next to us. They get 1900 horsepower out of basically the same engine. One 2600 cubic inch engine on one aircraft. So we have two on here. You know, it's a fantastic engine. It's extremely reliable. They used these for just years and years and years, and they made a ton of them. They were on the Avenger, the Havoc, Mariner, this aircraft. So Wikipedia says something like 50,000. The math doesn't work particularly well. I suspect they made 60, 70,000 of these engines. And you know, that's again why the United States Air Force kept using this aircraft, is they had a lot of parts and it was a solid platform. Fuel consumption, people ask. Typically, the fuel consumption runs about 75 gallons an hour per side, 150 gallons. So it's a fairly thirsty aircraft. Obviously, there's more aircraft that are even more thirsty than this, but it's not a cheap aircraft to operate. That's for sure when it comes to fuel consumption. Why don't we pop inside here and I can talk a little bit about the turret. Now you can see up there, remember we mentioned that there's a turret in the aft section, which is the bell turret. This is a Bendix turret. There aren't a lot of fully functional Bendix turrets. Some of the B-25s, they're empty, just a shell, or other ones will have like a Martin turret on it because Bendix turrets are so incredibly rare. This one, the Amplidines work, so it does fully rotate and it does elevate up and down. In fact, we were operating it just a couple of days ago when we came from South St. Paul to AirVenture here. Let's go inside. All right, let me get a little situated here. And I'm going to show you how this hatch closes, because you might as well see how this all works. So you pull it up, the hatch actually contracts, this floor goes in, and now I have a flat floor. You've got a couple of ways of deploying the hatch. We have one of the hatch controls is here, and then let's say I needed to get out of this aircraft. I've got my parachute on. The problem is, if I try to go out of this hatch and I'm going 130 miles an hour, that hatch is going to be flopping right against me. So by pulling the red handle there, releases a couple of pins and I jettison the hatch. Same thing happens in the aft section, same hatch configuration. The releases are just in a little bit different area. The aircraft has a number of ways to get out of it. We have an emergency escape over the pilot and the co-pilot. There's also an escape in the nose, and then of course we have the hatch here. In the aft section, similar scenario. We have a hatch that can be jettisoned. We have an emergency escape panel that's round on the side of the aircraft, and then if you're in the rear gun position, you take your hand over your left shoulder, pull a pin, releases the pins, and then you can throw the canopy off, and you can get out that way. So as far as survivability, it's really, really a good aircraft for that. So this is the famous Bendix turret. So you climb up inside, you get your shoulders in here. I can kind of stuff mine in here. It's definitely designed for young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, and they're only 140, 150 pounds. These are small young men back in 1943, 44, 45. You scoot yourself up, you lift from behind you, lock the seat into place, and you are locked in. Your hand controls go like this, and you go left, right, up, and down. And it's not a very pleasant place to be in. You do have heater controls right here to have your heated suit, but when you're up there and you're turning and the 50 cals are moving and the slots open up, the air just howls around you. And now mind you, this is an incredibly loud aircraft with the short stacks. You know, it doesn't purr like a B-17. This thing screams and growls. So if you don't have head protection on, hearing protection, you're gonna slowly but surely liquefy your eardrums. It is really a loud aircraft. You'd be shocked. I've seen the B-29 take off, you know, with the big 4 engines there, and the B-25 with its 2 is just about as loud. It's kind of incredible that way. So let me go ahead and unlock this. Oh, there we go. Get this out of the way. So this pedestal completely locks into the frame and it pivots all the way around. So you need to be away from this aircraft when it's in full operation. I mean, nothing will stop this. Amplidynes for it, which controls the DC amplidynes, they're up in the bomb bay, and we talked about the amount of stuff that's stored in the bomb bay. And it's, when you're looking forward, it's on the left-hand side behind the new 522 radio assembly that we're installing with that restoration. If you want, let's go into the nose of the aircraft. I'll show you some of that, and then we're going to have one of our pilots come up and we can talk a little bit about what's going on in the flight deck and some of the restoration projects that have happened up here. All right, well, we made it up into the nose of our B-25 here. So we have the famous Norton bomb site that if you ever get a chance to read about the Norton bomb site and the mystique about it, you know, they spent almost as much money as half of what they spent in the Manhattan Project. So, you know, it was claimed to be able to bomb a pickle barrel. And under ideal conditions, it was a good bomb site. Unfortunately, it wasn't designed particularly well for the cloud cover and the high altitude conditions in Europe. So we have one of those in here. We also have the 50 cal to kind of show the two different configurations. Kind of a fun fact, this is the only piece of glass in this aircraft, you know, except for on the gauges, and it's optically neutral. Otherwise, everything else in here, anywhere from the windscreens to for the turret, everything is plexiglass in this aircraft. Now we can drop ordnance. All of our solenoids work, so and we can drop individuals or we can drop them as a full salvo. If it's a salvo, then it's going to go and they're going to come down in a nice packet. And we also have arming solenoids in order to basically activate or inactivate the fuses on the twin fused iron bombs. And in the top of the bomb bay, we have two 250-pound iron dumb bombs in this aircraft. Let's see, restoration wise, we have a little bit left to go. Behind you here, we're going to end up doing the armor plating, so that'll be one of our next big projects. That'll be probably happening maybe in the next 3 years. There's a lot of things that have to happen before that time. And there were different configurations. So you're going to see some B-25s that have a 50 cal here. Miss Mitchell did not have that. There's also some that have cheek packs. So you're going to have twin 50s on each side. Those were not on Miss Mitchell. It was not designed for a ground attack mission. That's not what its role was. Let's see what else. You could also have a 75mm cannon, which would be in the H models or the G models. That would be filling this whole area up in here. They had a regular field piece, and then they had an aviation version in the H models. The G model, which was the first one, had the field piece in it. That would have filled all the way in here, and then there was a cannoneer in back. So it was highly adaptable. You could take this nose off and you can put a hard nose on. You could do a stacked 8-gun nose and still a J. It just doesn't have the greenhouse. And that's the thing I really like about this airplane. It always seemed like if they could come up with something that they wanted this airplane to do, more often than not, it would perform that mission that was prescribed to it. So I don't really think in World War II there's certainly any aircraft that are more adaptable than the North American Aviation B-25 bomber.
And I'm Trevor Hinson. I'm the operations officer for the Minnesota wing of the CAF, and also one of the instructor pilots on the B-25. Been flying this airplane probably about 5 years now, so we'll get into some of the cockpit stuff here. Pretty standard stuff. We got 2 batteries in the airplane. Our generator switches are on the left side in this airplane, and you know, a lot of these B-25s, these switches are just kind of shotgunned around, and no two are alike. I've got an inverter switch, nav lights, beacon, pitot heat, air filters on this airplane. I'm sure, like Mitch talked about earlier, North American built hydraulic airplane, so that's on one of our hydraulic systems. So for filtered air, it's hydraulically powered, actuated by the electric switch there. We've got fire detection on the airplane. So we've got our lights here with the bottle switches, and then we've got a loop test. And it's actually a little heating coil, so we'll test that on power up and test the fire detection both in the accessory section and forward in the engine section of each engine. Got some circuit breakers there, pretty standard stuff. Normal 6-pack. Obviously got a little bit more modern stuff in this airplane. We do fly at IFR. It's IFR capable, and you know, we're not doing anything hard IFR on it, but there have been times we've filed IFR to get through a layer back home from a show. So we've got the Garmin stack in the middle, some more modern stuff there. Some more switches up here. This is basically a lot of the engine switches. So it takes about 3 hands to start this airplane. So we've got energize and mesh for starter on each engine, and our primer switch. Mechanics did a nice job of redoing this, so we can read all the labels now, but right is pulling, left is pushing. And we do have initial starters on this thing, so we'll energize, mesh, and then prime. Boost pump switches, landing light switches. We've got fuel transfers. This airplane no longer has the aux tanks outboard of the wings. So these are in-op now. We don't use them anymore. We just got the main tank, so 670 gallons on board total. Mag switches, the master ignition switch there. Feather buttons like any other big round motor airplane. And moving on to the right, most of our engine gauges are on the right side in this airplane, so temperature, pressure gauges. We've got an attitude indicator for the right side. Fuel gauges, and some hydraulic pressure on the far right side there. Alternate static source switch over there. Got electrical panel stuff down here, amp meter, voltmeter, some more circuit breakers, radio master switch. This is our Bombay switch for up front in the cockpit. And defroster no longer works. Standard throttle quadrant setup, so throttles, props, and mixers, just like any other piston twin. I've got a throttle lock here, friction lock for the mixers and props. Trim wheel, kind of like a twin Cessna. Moving on down, we've got superchargers. The high blower actually does work in this airplane, although we never really use it. We're never flying the thing high enough to really get the use out of it. If I remember right, it's about 350 horsepower loss just to make up for switching into high blower. So we're never really flying it high enough to get the use out of it. Carb heat, that gets used quite a bit. These Bendix carbs and these Wrights like making ice, so those get used fairly often. I've seen carb ice up to solid 70 degrees outside, so those get some good use out of them. Moving on down, we've got cow flaps. Like I said earlier, North American loves their hydraulics, so everything's hydraulic in this airplane. Gear handle, trim switches, so aileron trim, rudder trim. We've got our backup hydraulic hand pump. This airplane has the newer style brake lever, so a lot of the older airplanes you'd see just one lever. It's got a nitrogen bottle that you blow for the emergency brakes. This has 2 individual hydraulic levers for the backup brakes. And then moving back, we've got our hydraulic system selector valve. So 3 positions on that. We've got a position for brake. If we lose the normal brakes, normally leave that normal, so when we pump the hand pump, it's pressurizing the normal hydraulic system. And then the latch position is in case the main gear down locks aren't engaged, that latch position will drive home those down lock pins by use of hydraulic pressure. And that's pretty much it for the cockpit. Like I said, overall it's a basic big piston twin, so not much to it. All right, thanks for joining us on the walk around of Miss Mitchell. Hopefully we'll see everybody in air show. Try and go to as many shows as we can, giving rides, showing off the airplane. And you can find out more info on cafmn.org. We've got rides links, donation links, everything on there. So appreciate you coming along.